He wasn't supposed to make history. In fact, he wasn't even supposed to get the job. The engineers who ran the show in the 1930s American aircraft industry saw him as too young, too ambitious, and far too reckless. They told him his designs were impractical, unrealistic, too radical. But that same man, the one nobody wanted, would end up creating one of the most feared and effective fighter planes of World War II. A machine so revolutionary that it left German pilots staring in disbelief, wondering how the Americans had suddenly jumped a generation ahead in aerial warfare. The story begins not in a factory or a hangar, but in rejection. Clarence Kelly Johnson was a kid who didn't fit in anywhere. Born in Michigan to Swedish immigrants, he was the kind of student teachers would quietly label difficult, he argued. He corrected them. He saw flaws where others saw perfection. By the time he entered the University of Michigan, that stubbornness had already hardened into something sharper, conviction. He wasn't there to memorize what had been done. He was there to imagine what could be. When Lockheed, a small aircraft company at the time, came to the university looking for new engineers, Johnson applied. He showed them his designs, aerodynamic sketches that looked like something out of a science fiction magazine. They laughed, literally. His ideas broke every convention. Twin booms, tricycle landing gear, shapes that look like arrows. The recruiters told him flat out, this isn't how airplanes are built. So he did what every great engineer does when faced with arrogance. He tested them. He took their current plane model, the Lockheed Model 10 Electra, and proved mathematically that it was aerodynamically flawed. He wrote an entire report explaining exactly why. When the executives received it, they were furious. Who was this college kid telling them their aircraft was unstable? But then they tested it. And he was right. That single act of rebellion, that audacity to say you're wrong and here's why, got him hired. Johnson was just 23. But within a few years, he'd rise to become the driving force behind one of the most legendary aircraft programs ever conceived, the Skunk Works. But before the fame, before the spy planes and stealth jets, there was one challenge that would define his entire career: outsmarting the Luftwaffe. By 1939, Europe was on fire. Nazi Germany had redefined what air power meant. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 dominated the skies. They were fast, agile, and deadly. American planes, on the other hand, were sluggish and outdated. And the U.S. Army Air Corps knew it. They needed something extraordinary, a fighter that could climb higher, fly faster, and dive harder than anything the Germans had ever seen. But when Lockheed was asked to come up with a design, the challenge was impossible by normal standards. The specifications demanded an aircraft that could exceed 400 miles per hour, climb to over 20,000 feet, and maintain range and stability, all at a time when most American engines struggled to even reach half those speeds. Every established engineer said it couldn't be done. Every engineer except Kelly Johnson. Johnson wasn't interested in doing things the normal way. He believed that if you obeyed all the rules, you'd miss all the breakthroughs. So he tore up the rule book. Instead of one engine, he proposed two. Instead of a traditional single fuselage, he split it into twin booms connected by a central cockpit pod. It looked alien, and that's exactly how people described it. Even the test pilots nicknamed it the fork-tailed devil. The plane would become the P-38 Lightning. At first, almost no one believed it could work. Critics said it was too complex, too heavy, too experimental. But Johnson's instincts were different. He'd studied airflow, drag, and stress distribution more deeply than almost anyone of his time. He understood that two engines meant more than just power. It meant survival. If one failed, the pilot could still make it home. It also meant the plane could carry far more fuel and weapons without losing speed. The P-38's engines were placed on long nacelles extending from the central cockpit, giving it that unmistakable double-tail silhouette. To the untrained eye, it looked like two small planes welded together. But in the air, it behaved like a predator, stable at high altitudes, swift in a dive, and capable of speeds over 400 miles per hour, making it the first American fighter to break that barrier. When the prototypes rolled out, even Lockheed's executives were nervous. Test pilots said it felt too powerful. The vibration, the torque, it was a beast. But when the Army Air Corps saw what it could do, they immediately ordered hundreds. They didn't just see a fighter, they saw a symbol, a declaration that American engineering could leapfrog the Luftwaffe's dominance. The first time German pilots encountered the P-38, they thought it was a bomber. Its twin tails confused radar operators and spotters. But when it closed in, fast, low, and deadly accurate, confusion turned to panic. Luftwaffe aces like Adolf Galland would later admit that the Lightning changed their entire view of American air power. But here's where the story gets deeper. Because Kelly Johnson didn't stop at making a fast plane, he wanted to make it unstoppable. He and his small team of engineers at Lockheed began innovating features that were unheard of for the time. Compressibility flaps, turbo superchargers, self-sealing fuel tanks. Every inch of the Lightning was designed for one purpose: dominance through intelligence. Still, it wasn't all triumph. The P-38 had a brutal learning curve. Pilots who tried to handle it like older planes often lost control during dives. The compressibility effect, where air behaves differently at high speeds, caused several crashes early on. Engineers called it the invisible wall. Johnson refused to accept that limitation. He built wind tunnel models, tested wing shapes, and refined the controls until he found a solution. By adjusting dive flaps, he made the P-38 one of the few planes that could recover safely from near supersonic dives. And then came the war. When the U.S. finally entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, the P-38 was ready. It became the backbone of American air superiority in the Pacific and Europe. It escorted bombers deep into enemy territory, fought over North Africa, and hunted down Japanese fighters across the vast stretches of the Pacific. Its twin engines gave it unmatched range, allowing it to fly missions other fighters couldn't even dream of. But perhaps its greatest moment came in April 1943 over the Solomon Islands. American intelligence had intercepted a coded message. The Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind of Pearl Harbor, was flying to Bougainville. The U.S. wanted revenge. The mission they planned would stretch the limits of every aircraft they had. Only one could make it: the P-38 Lightning. At dawn, 18 P-38 Lightnings roared into the sky from Guadalcanal, each pilot knowing they were about to fly one of the most dangerous missions of the war. It wasn't just a long-range intercept. It was a race against time. They had to cross nearly 400 miles of open ocean, arrive at the precise minute Yamamoto's plane would be in the air, and take him down before his escort could react. The smallest miscalculation in timing or navigation meant disaster. Kelly Johnson's aircraft had never been tested like this before. Every ounce of fuel mattered, every gust of wind threatened to throw the plan off. But the P-38's design, those twin turbo-supercharged engines, and its aerodynamic efficiency made the impossible possible. For the first time in the war, the Americans could reach farther than the Japanese expected. As the formation neared Bougainville, the lead pilot, Rex Barber, spotted two Japanese transport planes in the distance, escorted by Zero fighters. There was no time to think. The P-38s dove. In a matter of seconds, tracer fire streaked across the sky. Barber locked onto one of the transports, Yamamoto's plane, and opened fire. The P-38's concentrated nose-mounted cannons tore through the fuselage. Smoke poured out. The aircraft spiraled down into the jungle below. The architect of Pearl Harbor was dead. That single mission sent shockwaves across the Pacific. And it cemented the P-38 Lightning's reputation as more than just a fighter. It was a weapon of precision, built by an engineer who had once been told he was too unconventional to succeed. But for Kelly Johnson, this was only the beginning. The war was accelerating, and so were the Germans. In Europe, the Luftwaffe's new aircraft were faster, deadlier, and more maneuverable. The Allies were desperate to maintain an edge, and Johnson was under immense pressure to keep evolving the Lightning. He became known for his near-obsessive work ethic. His team at Lockheed worked in secret, around the clock, often sleeping next to the machines they were designing. He demanded absolute discipline, but inspired equal loyalty. Engineers said working for him was like working for a general, but one who actually fought alongside you. Under Johnson's guidance, new variants of the P-38 were created, faster, lighter, better armed. The P-38J and P-38L models introduced improved engines and cooling systems that allowed them to perform in extreme altitudes where other planes stalled out. And while many American fighters struggled to match the German FW-190s and Me-109s in European dogfights, the Lightning carved out its own niche. It wasn't about turning tighter, it was about outthinking the enemy. Johnson understood something most engineers didn't. Technology alone doesn't win wars, adaptability does. So he kept tweaking the Lightning to meet the realities of combat. Pilots reported issues, and within days, Johnson's team would modify parts and ship improvements directly to the front lines. This flexibility made the P-38 not just a machine, but a living, evolving weapon. In the Pacific, pilots fell in love with it. It could take brutal damage and still fly home on one engine. It had unmatched range, a necessity in a theater where islands were separated by hundreds of miles. The Japanese began calling it two planes, one pilot, out of both respect and fear. And while the iconic P-51 Mustang would later steal much of the spotlight, many aces quietly admitted that the P-38 had saved the Allies long before the Mustang arrived. One of those aces was Richard Bong, America's top-scoring fighter ace of World War II, with 40 aerial victories, every single one achieved in a P-38 Lightning. He once said the Lightning felt like an extension of himself, a machine that thought as fast as he did. It could climb steeply, dive with precision, and deliver a lethal punch with its clustered machine guns and 20mm cannon. But what made it truly lethal was its stability at high altitudes, where the thin air crippled most other aircraft. The German pilots who faced the P-38 over Europe found themselves outmaneuvered in unexpected ways. The Lightning didn't play by the same rules. It could dive faster, shoot straighter, and withstand hits that would destroy lighter fighters. Luftwaffe reports began describing encounters with, quote, twin-tailed devils, aircraft that appeared out of the sun, struck with blinding speed, and disappeared before the Germans could regroup. What they didn't realize was that every one of those design decisions, the twin tails, the turbo superchargers, the concentrated firepower, had come from one man who had been told, years earlier, that he'd never make it in aviation. Still, Johnson wasn't content. He wasn't the kind of engineer who celebrated success. To him, success meant the next challenge was overdue. He started building what would later become Lockheed's most legendary division, the Skunk Works. It wasn't a fancy office or a massive factory. It was a small, fenced-off corner of Lockheed's Burbank facility where the rules didn't apply. His philosophy was simple: small teams, minimal bureaucracy, and maximum creativity. He handpicked engineers who didn't just follow instructions but questioned them. The lessons learned from the P-38's development would form the DNA of Skunk Works itself. Johnson proved that a handful of brilliant, relentless people could outpace entire corporations and even entire nations if they had freedom to think. Back on the front lines, the Lightning continued to shape the war. It wasn't just fighting, it was gathering intelligence, photographing enemy positions, escorting bombers, and even delivering critical strikes deep into enemy territory. One of its biggest contributions came from reconnaissance missions. The P-38 was modified into a photo recon variant, stripping away weapons for cameras. Those aircraft brought back high-altitude images that guided Allied invasions from Italy to Normandy. Every major advance in Europe relied on information gathered by P-38s flying silently above the clouds, beyond the reach of enemy guns. By 1944, even as newer aircraft took over the headlines, Kelly Johnson's creation had become the backbone of Allied strategy. And yet, for every headline about dogfights and aces, there was something few people knew. Johnson was already secretly designing the next generation of aircraft in the background. He knew that once the war ended, aviation would never be the same again. The age of propellers was ending. Jet engines were the future. And while most of the world was still celebrating victories in the skies, Johnson was already thinking about how to make planes that could outrun sound itself. He understood that innovation wasn't about speed for its own sake, it was about control. It was about ensuring that the next war, if it ever came, wouldn't catch America unprepared. And as the final year of World War II unfolded, he and his small group at Lockheed began laying the groundwork for something far more ambitious than the P-38. The same rejected engineer who had changed the course of the air war was now preparing to change the future of flight entirely. But to understand what came next, the shift from piston engines to jets, from aluminum to invisibility, we have to understand what made Kelly Johnson different. It wasn't just his intelligence. It was his defiance. He never believed genius belonged in committees or in rules written by cautious men. He believed in risk, in boldness, in the kind of creativity that gets you laughed at first and applauded later. And for that, history would remember him not just as an engineer, but as the man who redefined what human imagination could do with metal and sky. Johnson was in his prime when the war finally started tipping toward the Allies. Factories that once doubted him now ran day and night building his designs. The P-38 Lightning had gone from a curiosity to a legend, but to Johnson, legends were dangerous. They made people complacent. He had already seen what happened to engineers who stopped questioning themselves. So while the Lightning tore through the skies over Europe and the Pacific, he started sketching on napkins and scraps of paper ideas that even his own team thought were impossible. He wanted a fighter that could fly faster than sound. In 1944, that sounded like madness. Jet engines were still experimental, heavy, and unstable. But Johnson had already learned that progress never comes from permission. He began working on what would become America's first operational jet fighter, the P-80 Shooting Star, using many of the same principles that had guided the Lightning: minimal drag, maximum efficiency, and ruthless simplicity. While other design teams were buried under committees and paperwork, Johnson cut through it all. He created a culture of speed and trust. If an engineer had an idea, it went straight to testing. If it worked, it stayed. If it didn't, it was gone by morning. That system, fast, flexible, fearless, would soon become the trademark of the Skunk Works. But even as the jet era dawned, Johnson never forgot what the P-38 represented. It wasn't just a machine, it was proof that vision beats consensus. Pilots who flew it still talk about how it felt alive, how it didn't just fly but seemed to think ahead of them. The Luftwaffe, once the symbol of unbeatable engineering, found itself facing an American aircraft that outclimbed, outdove, and outranged nearly everything they had. When the war finally ended, tens of thousands of P-38s had flown more than 100 different mission types: dogfights, bombings, reconnaissance, long-range escort, even lightning-fast strikes deep in enemy territory. The plane that had been laughed at for its strange shape became one of the most versatile aircraft ever built. After the victory, Lockheed executives expected Johnson to take a break. He refused. In the same small office where he once defended his rejected designs, he began drafting the future: jets that could cross continents in hours, spy planes that could photograph entire countries without being seen, and bombers invisible to radar. And through it all, he carried a lesson that every creative person learns the hard way: that rejection is often the first sign you're onto something extraordinary. He once told a young engineer, "If they're not fighting you, you're not far enough ahead." That philosophy would shape everything that came next: the U-2, the State Route 71 Blackbird, and the entire idea of stealth technology. But the roots of it, the defiance, the independence, the refusal to obey limits, were born in that first moment of rejection at the University of Michigan, when a stubborn young engineer proved that he was right and everyone else was wrong. Even decades later, Luftwaffe veterans admitted they had underestimated America's ability to innovate. They thought of American engineering as slow, heavy, industrial, not elegant, not refined. The P-38 shattered that stereotype. It forced them to realize that intelligence, when paired with boldness, could outfly brute precision. Johnson used to walk through hangars at night, touching the cold metal of the planes he'd designed, as if he could feel the spirit of flight inside them. To him, aircraft weren't just machines. They were proof that imagination could be made real, and that's what separated him from every other engineer of his generation. He didn't just build airplanes, he built possibilities. The irony, of course, is that it all began because someone told him he couldn't. And maybe that's the deeper story behind every great invention. It's not about talent or timing or luck. It's about defiance, about hearing no and deciding to turn it into fuel, about seeing rejection not as a wall, but as a door you just haven't kicked open yet. That's what Kelly Johnson did. That's why, long after the war ended, the name Lockheed still echoed in hangars, in history books, in the hearts of every pilot who ever looked up and dreamed. Because a single rejected engineer refused to accept ordinary, and in doing so, designed the plane that outsmarted the Luftwaffe and changed the sky forever. Long after the roar of propellers faded and the world moved on from war, the legend of the P-38 Lightning lived on. In museums and dusty hangars across America, veterans would stop in front of that strange, twin-tailed silhouette and smile. They didn't see just aluminum or rivets. They saw what it represented: courage, imagination, and the will of one man who refused to bow to mediocrity. Kelly Johnson became a myth of his own making. Reporters called him the, quote, genius of aviation. But that wasn't quite true. He wasn't quiet. He was blunt, demanding, impossible at times. But he was honest, brutally so. When something didn't work, he said it. When someone wasted time, he ended the meeting. And when someone told him something couldn't be done, he did it faster. His later projects, the U-2 spy plane and the State Route 71 Blackbird, would redefine the limits of flight. But every one of those breakthroughs carried the same DNA as the P-38, a hatred for stagnation, a love for risk, and a faith that daring ideas always find their way into the sky. The same traits that once got him rejected became the ones that made him irreplaceable. It's easy to forget just how wild the P-38's design really was for its time. 2 engines instead of 1 meant double the complexity. A central pod for the pilot meant unconventional aerodynamics. Even the concentrated nose guns, instead of being spread across the wings, went against decades of design tradition. Yet, those very details gave it deadly precision. A pilot didn't have to worry about gun convergence. Wherever he aimed, the bullets went straight. The Lightning could hit targets from distances that stunned enemy pilots. German aces couldn't believe how hard it was to escape once a Lightning had locked on. Reports from Luftwaffe squadrons describe P-38s dropping from the clouds like metallic hawks, opening fire with devastating accuracy, then vanishing into the horizon. It was psychological warfare as much as physical. The Luftwaffe's confidence once their greatest strength began to fracture. There's a kind of poetry in that. The Germans, who prided themselves on engineering perfection, were outsmarted by an aircraft they had dismissed as ungainly and strange. And that irony wasn't lost on Kelly Johnson. To him, beauty was function. If something worked better, it was automatically beautiful, even if the world hadn't caught up yet. When post-war interviews asked him how he came up with his ideas, Johnson said something simple but profound. The airplane is just a problem in physics. The trick is not to be afraid of the problem. That mindset separated him from his peers. While others feared failure, he saw it as a data point. To him, the only real failure was timidity. As the 1950s rolled in, aviation changed faster than anyone could keep up. Jets broke sound barriers, missiles replaced dogfights, and the Cold War demanded machines that could do the impossible. But through it all, the principles born from the Lightning remained. Every stealth jet, every supersonic craft, every reconnaissance platform owes a small debt to that awkward twin-tailed plane that proved one man's vision could outrun an empire. What's fascinating is how close all of it came to never happening. One more rejection letter, one more arrogant executive, one more moment of doubt, and maybe the P-38 would have stayed a sketch in some forgotten notebook. But Kelly Johnson's stubbornness saved it. His refusal to compromise became the backbone of American aerospace innovation for half a century. The real lesson in his story isn't just about airplanes. It's about the psychology of creation itself. Great ideas rarely look great at first. They look strange. They make people uncomfortable. They challenge what's already working. But that discomfort, that resistance, is the sign you're breaking ground. Every genius who ever changed the world had to walk through that same fire. Johnson's fire just happened to be made of metal and sky. So when you look at the P-38 today, that long nose, the twin booms, the elegant balance between aggression and grace, you're not just looking at a relic. You're looking at proof that rejection can be the most powerful motivator in the world. You're looking at the machine that forced the Luftwaffe to rethink everything they thought they knew about air superiority. And maybe, if you listen closely, you can still hear it. The echo of those turbo-supercharged engines slicing through thin air at 30,000 feet. A reminder that innovation isn't born from acceptance, but from defiance. The story of Kelly Johnson isn't just the story of an engineer. It's the story of a mindset, one that believes brilliance isn't granted. It's earned by those who refuse to give up when everyone else stops believing. That's how a rejected American engineer designed the plane that outsmarted the Luftwaffe, and in doing so redefined what humanity could build when courage becomes the blueprint.